Welcome back, cat lovers, to Cat Whisperer. If you've been following along with the litter box training episode already, welcome back. And if this is your first time here, that's completely fine too. Everything in this guide stands on its own. This time, we're doing something a little different from our usual format. Instead of one focused topic, we're covering the entire arc of what actually matters most in a kitten's early life, all in one place, start to finish. We're going to walk through the socialization window that shapes your cat's personality for the rest of their life, exactly how to bring your kitten home and get through those first fragile days, how to teach them to play with your hands the right way so you're not dealing with a bitey adult cat down the line, and finally, how to recognize and respond to your kitten's first health emergencies, because being prepared before something happens is genuinely the single biggest factor in how well it goes. Think of this as the complete new kitten survival guide, everything you need in one sitting, built to be watched all the way through, or bookmarked and returned to section by section as your kitten grows and each stage becomes relevant. We're covering a lot of ground today, so let's not waste any more time on preamble and get straight into it. Let's start with something that shapes literally the rest of your kitten's personality, and that most owners either don't know about at all or find out about too late to make full use of. We're talking about socialization, and specifically the tiny window of time when it matters the most. Here's the headline fact of this entire section. There is a specific narrow window in a kitten's development, roughly between 2 and 9 weeks of age, sometimes described as extending out to about 14 weeks in some individual cats, where their brain is uniquely primed to form positive associations with new experiences. This is called the socialization period, and it is, without exaggeration, the single most important stretch of time in your cat's entire life for determining whether they grow up confident and easygoing or anxious and reactive. What happens or doesn't happen during these few weeks leaves a mark that can last for the following 15 or 18 years. That's not an exaggeration for dramatic effect. It's just how feline brain development works. So why does this window exist, and why does it close? During those early weeks, a kitten's brain is going through an intense period of neural growth, where connections between neurons are being formed at a much faster rate than they will be later in life. This is nature's way of preparing a young animal to rapidly learn about their environment, while they're still under the protection of their mother, so that by the time they're ready to be more independent, they already have a working mental map of what's safe and what isn't. Anything the kitten experiences positively during this window tends to get filed away as safe permanently. And anything they don't experience at all during this window can end up filed away, essentially by default, as unfamiliar and therefore potentially suspicious later in life. This is why a cat who never saw a man with a beard during their socialization window might grow into an adult cat who is inexplicably nervous around bearded men specifically, even though nothing bad ever happened to them. The brain simply never built the neural pathway that says, this is normal and fine. If you've ever heard about the equivalent window in puppies, you might notice the timing looks a little different, and that trips a lot of people up when they're used to dog advice and try to apply it directly to a kitten. Puppies have a socialization window that runs longer, generally stretching out to somewhere around 12 to 16 weeks, which gives dog owners a more forgiving runway. Kittens, on the other hand, are working with a window that opens and largely closes much earlier, which is part of why kitten socialization tends to get overlooked. By the time a lot of new owners even bring a kitten home, at 8 weeks, they may already be most of the way through the most sensitive part of it without realizing it. This isn't meant to alarm you, it's meant to explain why timing matters so much more with cats than the general pet ownership advice floating around online tends to suggest, which is exactly why we're covering it before we get into anything else. It's also worth understanding what's happening biologically during this stretch, at least in broad strokes, because it helps explain why gentle, low-pressure exposure works so much better than anything more intense. During the socialization period, a kitten's stress response system, specifically the part of the brain involved in fear and threat detection, is still relatively underdeveloped compared to how reactive it will become later. This is actually a feature, not a flaw. It means a young kitten can process new, unfamiliar things with curiosity rather than alarm, because the threat detection machinery simply hasn't fully come online yet. As the kitten matures past this window, that system matures too, and starts flagging unfamiliar things as potentially worth caution by default. This is precisely why the exact same new experience, say, meeting a dog for the first time, tends to be processed completely differently by an 8-week-old kitten versus an 8-month-old cat. The 8-week-old kitten's brain is built to explore first and worry later. The 8-month-old cat's brain is built to worry first and explore only once safety has been established. Once you understand this shift, it makes total sense why front-loading positive experiences during the early window is so much more effective than trying to introduce the exact same experiences for the first time once a cat is already an adult. Now, before we go further, I want to address something important, because I know some of you watching this already have a kitten who's past 9 weeks or 14 weeks or is fully grown, and you might be feeling a wave of guilt right now. Don't. This window represents the period of maximum receptivity, not the only window that exists at all. Cats can and do continue learning and adjusting throughout their lives, and plenty of under-socialized kittens grow into wonderful, secure adult cats with patient, consistent care. What this window gives you is an easier path, not the only path. So if your kitten is already past this stage, stick around anyway, because a lot of what we cover today still applies, just with more patience and smaller steps required. Let's talk about who's responsible for the earliest part of this window, because if you're getting a kitten from a breeder or a rescue, a significant portion of this critical period, especially the 2 to 7 week range, happens before the kitten ever comes home with you. This is actually one of the most important and most overlooked questions to ask before you even choose a kitten. Ask the breeder or the rescue organization specifically what kind of handling and exposure the kittens have had. Have they been handled daily by multiple different people? Have they been exposed to normal household sounds? Have they met other animals? A kitten raised in a quiet back room with minimal human contact until 8 weeks old is starting their life with a real handicap through no fault of their own, and it's something you'll likely need to work harder to compensate for once they're in your home. If you're getting a kitten from an unknown or uncertain background, a stray litter, a barn cat situation, or anywhere the early history is murky, don't panic, but do go in expecting to do more deliberate work in the time you do have left in that window, and to be more patient afterward if the window has already mostly closed by the time you meet them. Let's get into the actual practical work now, because this is Cat Whisperer, and I promised you actionable steps, not just theory. The first pillar of socialization is human exposure, and specifically, exposure to variety. A kitten who only ever interacts with one person in one consistent way tends to grow into a cat who is deeply bonded to that one person and deeply suspicious of literally everyone else, including house guests, new partners, or even other family members who simply weren't as involved early on. To build a cat who's comfortable around people in general, you want to intentionally introduce your kitten to a range of different humans during the socialization window. Different heights, different voices, men and women if you have kids in your life, supervised interaction with calm, gentle children, and people wearing different things, hats, sunglasses, boots. This might sound excessive, but remember, you're not trying to overwhelm the kitten. You're trying to build a mental category of humans in general as safe, rather than a mental category of one specific human as safe and everyone else as an unknown threat. The technique here matters as much as the exposure itself. Each new person should be calm, should let the kitten approach at their own pace, rather than reaching for the kitten immediately, and ideally should have a small treat or a bit of wet food to offer once the kitten shows curiosity. The goal is for every new person to register in the kitten's memory as associated with something pleasant. If you have friends coming over, this is a great excuse to ask them to spend 2 calm minutes with your kitten. It genuinely helps, and most people are happy to be part of it. I want to hear about your own experience here because every household is different. Did you make a point of introducing your kitten to lots of different people early on, or did that mostly happen naturally, just from daily life? Tell us in the comments. It helps other new kitten owners see what actually worked for real cats in real homes, not just what the theory says should work. The second pillar is handling, and this one gets skipped constantly, to the detriment of a lot of adult cats who end up hating the vet, hating nail trims, and hating being picked up in general. During the socialization window, gently and briefly get your kitten used to being touched in all the ways they'll need to tolerate as an adult. That means handling their paws, since nail trims will be a lifelong necessity. That means gently looking in their ears and opening their mouth briefly, since this mimics what a vet exam will involve. That means picking them up and holding them in a few different positions, not just the one position they personally prefer. Keep every one of these sessions extremely short. We're talking 10 to 20 seconds at most in the early days, and always end on a positive note, with praise or a small treat, before the kitten starts to struggle or show any sign of discomfort. You're building a bank of positive handling memories, not testing their patience. A mistake I see constantly is owners waiting until the first vet visit to introduce their kitten to being handled in these ways, and then wondering why the visit was traumatic for everyone involved. If your kitten has never had their paws touched, and the first time it happens is a stranger in a white coat doing it to trim their nails, that's an enormous, unfair leap for a young animal to make all at once. A few minutes a day, spread across the socialization window, makes an enormous difference to how your cat handles literally every vet visit for the rest of their life. The third pillar is sound exposure. Cats have extraordinarily sensitive hearing, several times more sensitive than ours, and an under-socialized cat can develop a lasting fear of ordinary household sounds, simply because they never had a chance to learn that those sounds are harmless. Vacuum cleaners, blenders, doorbells, the washing machine, a hairdryer, all of these are worth exposing your kitten to during the window at a distance at first, and always paired with calm energy from you, rather than a big reaction. If you flinch or rush to comfort your kitten dramatically every time a sound happens, you can actually communicate to them that the sound was something worth reacting to, which works against you. The better approach is to stay relaxed yourself, let the kitten observe the sound from a safe distance, and let them approach closer on their own timeline as their curiosity overcomes their caution. There are also audio resources designed specifically for this, recordings of thunderstorms, fireworks, and traffic noise, played at a very low volume and gradually increased over days or weeks, which some behaviorists recommend as a structured way to build sound tolerance. Particularly useful if you live somewhere prone to storms, or if you know fireworks are a regular occurrence in your area. The fourth pillar, and this one surprises a lot of people, is object and environment exposure. Kittens who are only ever kept in one small, unchanging environment during their socialization window can become adult cats who are unusually anxious about any environmental change later. New furniture, a rearranged room, travel, anything that disrupts their sense of a fixed, known world. You don't need to create chaos in your home to counteract this, but rotating a few toys, occasionally introducing a new object like a cardboard box, a paper bag, or a new type of surface to walk on, all of this builds general flexibility and resilience into how your kitten's brain approaches novelty as a concept. The goal isn't specific object familiarity, it's teaching the broader lesson that new things are generally worth investigating rather than generally worth fearing. The sixth pillar, and one that almost nobody thinks about until it's already too late, is carrier and travel exposure. Think about how most cats first experience their carrier. It comes out of the closet only when something stressful is about to happen, a vet visit, a move, an emergency. And then the cat spends the rest of their life associating the carrier itself with dread. Sometimes so strongly that just seeing it appear is enough to send them fleeing under the bed before you've even opened the door. This entire negative association is completely avoidable, and the socialization window is the ideal time to prevent it from ever forming in the first place. The fix is simple, and it costs you almost nothing except a little consistency. Leave the carrier out permanently as part of the normal furniture of your home, not tucked away in a closet and only produced for scary occasions. Put a soft blanket inside it. Occasionally toss a treat inside so your kitten wanders in on their own terms to investigate and gets a small reward for doing so. Let them nap in it if they want to. The goal is for the carrier to become just another cozy, unremarkable object in their environment, completely disconnected from any sense of an impending bad experience. Once that association is built early, car rides and vet visits later in life tend to go dramatically more smoothly, because at least one major variable, the carrier itself, is no longer a source of fear on top of everything else that's already happening. If you do have the opportunity, a few very short, calm car rides during the socialization window, even just around the block and back, going nowhere stressful, paired with treats and a calm voice, can meaningfully reduce car anxiety for the rest of your cat's life. This is one of those small investments of time early on that pays off enormously later, especially if you ever need to travel with your cat, move to a new home, or simply want vet visits to be less of an ordeal for everyone involved. Let's also talk about the role of litter mates, because if you adopted your kitten alongside a sibling, or if they came from a larger litter, this actually plays into socialization in a meaningful way. Kittens raised with litter mates through at least the early part of the socialization window tend to develop better bite inhibition, meaning they learn, through rough and tumble play with siblings, how hard is too hard, because a sibling who gets bitten too hard will yelp, stop playing, or retaliate, giving immediate, clear feedback. A kitten who's separated from their litter mates very early, before around 7 or 8 weeks, sometimes misses out on this feedback loop entirely and can grow into an adult cat with less refined bite inhibition during play, simply because nobody ever taught them where that line was. If this describes your kitten situation, it's worth being a little more deliberate about teaching bite inhibition yourself, which mostly comes down to immediately stopping play and withdrawing your attention the moment a bite is too hard, then resuming only once your kitten has calmed down so they learn that same lesson from you instead. On the flip side, if you've adopted 2 kittens together, or a kitten alongside an existing young cat close in age, you'll likely notice a lot of the socialization work almost happens on its own, since kittens learn an enormous amount simply by observing and mimicking each other. A confident kitten in a pair can sometimes help pull a more hesitant one out of their shell faster than any amount of deliberate exposure work from you alone, just through everyday play and proximity. Let's pause here, because I know a lot of you are watching this with kittens who are already showing some early personality, some bold and diving headfirst into everything, others hanging back and needing more encouragement. What's your kitten's personality been like so far? The fearless explorer or the cautious observer? Let us know in the comments. And if you've got a shy one, stick around, because we're going to talk specifically about how to work with more cautious kittens in just a moment. The 5th pillar is exposure to other animals, and this deserves its own careful discussion, because it's not simply about throwing your kitten into a room with another animal and hoping for the best. If you have another cat in the household, or plan to eventually, controlled, gradual introductions during the socialization window, teach your kitten that other cats are generally not a threat, which matters enormously if you ever want to add another cat down the line, or if your kitten will need to interact with other cats at a boarding facility or a vet's office. The same goes for dogs if you have a calm, well-trained dog in the household or in your extended circle. A kitten who has a single positive supervised encounter with a gentle dog during this window is far more likely to grow into a cat who can coexist peacefully with dogs later, compared to a kitten whose first ever dog encounter happens as an unsupervised adult cat with zero prior context. The key word throughout all of this is controlled. You're not looking for chaotic, high-energy encounters. You're looking for calm, brief, positive interactions where the kitten has an easy escape route if they want one, and where nothing frightening or overwhelming happens. A single bad encounter during this sensitive window can do more damage than several good ones can undo, so it's worth erring on the side of caution in short sessions rather than rushing things because you're excited for your animals to be friends. Now let's talk about the kitten, who doesn't seem to want any of this. Because not every kitten bounces eagerly into new experiences, and if you've got a naturally shy or cautious kitten, the approach needs to shift slightly. With a more timid kitten, the single most important principle is to never force an interaction. Let the kitten set the pace entirely. Sit on the floor at their level. Let them approach you rather than reaching toward them, and reward even tiny steps of bravery, sniffing your hand from a distance, taking one step closer with calm praise or a treat. Rushing a shy kitten, or worse, cornering them to force affection because you're eager to bond, almost always backfires and can extend their timeline of caution considerably rather than shortening it. Shy kittens often need the same exposures as bold kittens, just delivered in smaller doses, over more repetitions, with more patience baked into the process. One thing that helps enormously with shy or nervous kittens specifically is something called scent pairing. Before you attempt to physically introduce a new person or even a new object, let the kitten explore the scent of it first from a safe distance, on their own terms. A shirt worn by a new person, left in the kitten's space for a day before that person visits, can meaningfully lower the kitten's anxiety when the actual meeting happens, because the scent, and by extension the person, is no longer completely unfamiliar. I'd love to know if you've got a naturally more anxious kitten and what's worked for you. Sometimes the standard advice doesn't quite fit every personality, and hearing real stories from other owners in the comments genuinely helps people watching who are in the middle of this right now with their own shy kitten. Let's talk about a few common mistakes that undo good socialization work, because avoiding these matters just as much as doing the positive steps correctly. Mistake number 1, overwhelming the kitten with too much at once. More exposure is not always better exposure. A kitten who's introduced to 5 new people, 3 new sounds, and a car ride all in the same afternoon isn't getting 5 times the socialization benefit. They're getting overwhelmed. And an overwhelmed kitten's brain shifts into a stress response rather than a learning and exploration response, which can actually work against the goal you're trying to achieve. Spread new experiences out. Quality and calm pacing beats quantity and intensity every time. Mistake number 2, forcing physical contact. This one is incredibly common and incredibly counterproductive. Picking up a kitten who's actively trying to retreat, holding them despite squirming, or repeatedly pursuing them around the room because you want cuddles teaches your kitten that human hands are unpredictable and that their own signals of discomfort don't get respected. This is one of the fastest ways to create an adult cat who avoids handling altogether. Let every positive interaction be one the kitten chose to enter into. Mistake number 3, punishing fear responses. If a kitten hisses, swats, or bolts during a new experience, that is not defiance, and it's not something to correct. It's information. It's telling you the exposure was too much, too fast, or handled in the wrong way, and your job is to back off, slow down, and try again more gradually later, not to scold the reaction. Punishing a fear response teaches a kitten that expressing fear leads to additional bad consequences, which tends to suppress the outward signal without addressing the underlying fear at all, meaning you lose the ability to read your cat's honest signals in the future, which is a genuinely useful thing to be able to read for the rest of their life. Mistake number 4, inconsistency between household members. If one person in the home is calm and patient during handling sessions, and another is rough or impatient, your kitten's overall sense of humans as a safe category gets muddied. It's worth having a brief conversation with everyone in the household, including kids, about the same basic principles, letting the kitten approach, ending sessions positively, never forcing contact, so the message the kitten receives is consistent, no matter who they're interacting with. Mistake number 5, treating socialization like a one-time checklist rather than an ongoing habit. Some owners front-load a huge push of new experiences in the first week or two, then quietly let it taper off as life gets busy again. Socialization works best as a steady, low-intensity drip spread across the entire window, not a sprint that burns out after the first few days. If life gets hectic, it's completely fine to scale back the intensity temporarily, but try not to let weeks go by with zero new positive exposures during this specific stretch of your kitten's development, since this is genuinely the narrowest and most time-sensitive window you'll get. Mistake number 6, misreading play as aggression, or aggression as play, and responding incorrectly to either. Rough kitten play, pouncing, chasing, mock biting, wrestling is completely normal and is actually part of healthy development, and trying to suppress all of it can backfire just as much as ignoring genuine warning signs can. The difference usually comes down to body language. Play tends to involve a relaxed body, ears forward or only slightly back, and pauses where the kitten checks in or resets. Genuine fear or aggression tends to involve a stiff or crouched body, ears flattened hard against the head, dilated pupils, and no natural pauses in the behavior. Learning to tell these apart early means you'll respond appropriately, redirecting rough play toward a toy rather than your hands, while still recognizing and backing off from genuine distress when it shows up. Let's talk about what this actually looks like day to day, because I don't want to leave you with just a list of principles and no sense of a rhythm to follow. A reasonable daily approach during the socialization window might look something like this. A few short handling sessions spread through the day, each just 10 to 30 seconds, touching paws, ears, and gently restraining for a moment before releasing with praise. 1 or 2 calm introductions to something new each day, rather than a big group of new things all at once. This might be a new person, a new sound at low volume, or a new safe object to investigate. Ordinary daily life sounds left unmuffled rather than kept artificially quiet, so the kitten builds tolerance to the normal texture of a lived-in household. And plenty of unstructured play and rest time in between, because socialization isn't meant to feel like a curriculum to the kitten, it's meant to feel like simply living in a rich, varied, safe environment. Let's also touch on something specific to this being practical coaching style advice, rather than pure theory. If you've got a kitten currently in this window right now, here's a simple exercise you can try today. Sit on the floor, at a slight distance from your kitten, and just exist calmly for a few minutes without reaching for them or calling them over. Let them approach entirely on their own terms, sniff you, investigate, maybe climb into your lap, maybe not. This single exercise, repeated regularly, teaches your kitten that you are a predictable, low-pressure presence in their environment, which is one of the most foundational building blocks of trust there is. Now, a word on timing relative to vaccination schedules, because this is a legitimate concern a lot of new owners raise, and it's worth addressing directly. Kittens typically aren't considered fully protected by their vaccine series until somewhere around 16 weeks, which on the surface seems to create a conflict with a socialization window that peaks earlier, around 2 to 9 weeks. The generally accepted guidance from veterinary behaviorists is that the socialization benefits of controlled low-risk exposure during this window meaningfully outweigh the marginal disease risk, as long as you're being sensible about it. That means avoiding dog parks, avoiding unknown, unvaccinated animals of uncertain health status, and avoiding areas with heavy unknown animal traffic while still allowing supervised interactions with healthy, vaccinated household pets and human contact, which carries essentially none of that risk. If you're ever unsure about a specific planned exposure and your kitten's vaccination status, it's always worth a quick call to your vet. Most are happy to advise on what's reasonable for your specific situation and location. Let's talk briefly about kittens who came from a genuinely difficult start, ones who may have missed most or all of this window due to illness, being found as strays past this age, or simply an unknown history. If this describes your kitten, the work isn't wasted just because the ideal window has closed. It just requires a different mindset. Progress will likely be slower, setbacks may happen, and comparison to a kitten who had an ideal, well-socialized start isn't useful or fair to either cat. What matters is consistent, patient, low-pressure exposure over a longer timeline, always led by the cat's own comfort level rather than a schedule. Many cats who had rough starts go on to become deeply bonded, secure companions. It simply may take months rather than weeks, and that's completely normal. Before we wrap up, let's run through a few of the questions that come up most often around this topic. Can you over-socialize a kitten? Not in the sense of exposing them to too many good, calm experiences over time, but you absolutely can overwhelm a kitten by packing too much into too short a span, which is really more about pacing than about socialization itself being harmful. Spread things out, watch your kitten's body language, and let curiosity lead rather than a checklist. What if I got my kitten from a shelter and have no idea what their early history looked like? Treat it as an unknown. Lean toward the more cautious, patient approach we covered for shy kittens, and pay close attention to what specific things seem to trigger more hesitation, since that often gives you clues about gaps in their early exposure. A kitten who's fine with men but startles hard at anyone in a hat, for example, is telling you something concrete you can work with, and it gives you a specific, manageable starting point rather than a vague sense that your cat is just generally nervous. Is it too late if my kitten is already 4 or 5 months old? The most sensitive window has passed, but cats remain far more adaptable throughout adolescence than most people assume, generally up through around a year of age, before things become more fixed. You're not working against a closed door. You're just working with a door that requires more patience to open. Do indoor-only kittens need less socialization than kittens who'll eventually go outside? If anything, the opposite is often true. An indoor cat is likely to encounter fewer novel situations throughout their life overall, which means the experiences they do have during the socialization window carry proportionally more weight in shaping how they handle anything unexpected: a vet visit, a house guest, a thunderstorm later on. One last thing before the wrap-up. If you're currently in the thick of this window with your own kitten right now, I'd genuinely like to know what surprised you most so far. Some owners are shocked by how bold their kitten is right out of the gate. Others are surprised by just how much a few calm minutes a day seems to change their kitten's confidence within just a week or two. Share it in the comments. This kind of real-world feedback from all of you is honestly one of the best parts of putting this guide together. Let's bring this together into the core takeaways. The socialization window, roughly 2 to 9 weeks, and tapering out toward 14 weeks, is the single most impactful stretch of time for shaping your cat's lifelong temperament. During this window, prioritize calm, varied exposure to different people, gentle handling practice for future vet visits and nail trims, low-volume exposure to common household sounds, exposure to new objects, and mild environmental change, and careful, controlled introductions to other animals if relevant to your household. Avoid overwhelming your kitten with too much at once. Never force physical contact, never punish a fear response, and keep everyone in the household consistent in their approach. If your kitten is a bit older and has already missed part or all of this window, don't panic. Just shift toward smaller steps, more repetition, and more patience. The underlying principles still apply, they just take longer to pay off. If this section was useful, let us know down in the comments which stage your kitten is at right now. Still deep in the socialization window, just past it, or fully grown and you're working through this retroactively. It genuinely helps us understand where most of you actually are in this journey. One final thought before we move on. It's easy to treat something like socialization as a task to complete and check off, but honestly, the best version of this whole process doesn't feel like work at all. It feels like simply paying closer attention to your kitten during a stretch of time when that attention happens to matter enormously. You're not running a program, you're just being present, curious alongside them, and generous with patience during the few weeks when patience quite literally shapes the cat they're going to become. It won't always look tidy. Some days your kitten will surprise you with boldness. Other days they'll retreat somewhere quiet and want nothing to do with any of it. And both of those are completely fine. Get that part right. And everything else, the confidence, the trust, the ease around new people and new situations tends to follow naturally for the rest of their life. With all of that in mind, let's shift gears now to the actual day your kitten arrives home and the critical stretch of time right after that first moment. Because here's the thing nobody warns you about. The first 48 hours in a new home can set the emotional tone for weeks, sometimes months, of your kitten's adjustment. Get this window right, and you'll likely see a kitten who settles in confidently within days. Get it wrong, even with the best intentions, and you can end up with weeks of hiding, stress-eating problems, or a kitten who seems permanently on edge. So let's walk through exactly how to do this properly, from the moment you decide to bring a kitten home, all the way through their first week with you. Let's start before the kitten even arrives, with a question that trips up a lot of new owners. When is a kitten actually ready to leave their mother and litter mates? The honest answer is later than most people assume. Many places allow kittens to be rehomed at 8 weeks, and plenty of healthy, well-adjusted cats were separated at exactly that age. But the research on this is fairly consistent. Kittens who stay with their mother and litter mates until 12 to 13 weeks tend to show better social skills, better bite inhibition, and fewer behavioral issues later in life, compared to kittens separated at the earlier end of that range. The extra month isn't just about nutrition, it's about the ongoing lessons a kitten picks up from watching their mother and play fighting with siblings, lessons that are genuinely hard to replicate any other way. If you're in a position to choose and the breeder or foster situation supports it, waiting those extra few weeks is worth it. If your kitten is coming to you at 8 weeks because that's simply how the situation worked out, that's completely fine too. It just means a little more deliberate effort on your part in some of the areas we've already covered around socialization and bite inhibition. There's a legal and regulatory angle worth mentioning here too, since it varies quite a bit depending on where you live. Some regions have minimum age laws for selling or rehoming kittens, often set at 8 weeks, specifically because of the developmental concerns we just covered, while other places have no formal restriction at all. Leaving the decision entirely up to individual, breeders, shelters, or sellers. If you're working with a reputable breeder or a well-run shelter, they'll typically already be following age-appropriate guidelines without you needing to ask. But if you're getting a kitten through a more informal channel, someone's home litter, a listing you found online, a friend of a friend, it's worth asking directly what age the kittens will be at handoff, and gently pushing back if you're being offered a kitten younger than 8 weeks. A kitten separated too early, generally considered anything under 6 to 7 weeks, faces real risks beyond just the social skills we've discussed, including a less mature immune system and less developed self-regulation around eating and elimination, both of which can make those first weeks in a new home considerably harder for everyone involved. Now, let's talk about what you should have ready before the kitten ever sets a paw in your home. Because scrambling to buy supplies on day one with a stressed kitten already in the house is a recipe for a harder transition than it needs to be. You'll want a litter box already set up, filled and ready before arrival, placed somewhere quiet and away from where the food will go, for all the reasons a good litter setup matters. You'll want food and water bowls, ideally placed a reasonable distance from that litter box. You'll want a small amount of whatever food the kitten has already been eating, ideally the exact same brand, since switching food on top of a huge environmental change is genuinely too much change, stacked at once for a lot of kittens, and can trigger digestive upset right when you least want it. You'll want a carrier, which ideally the kitten has already started to get comfortable with if you've had any advanced contact, but if not, that's fine. We'll cover the ride home in a moment. You'll want a scratching post, since giving your kitten an appropriate outlet for scratching from day one heads off a lot of furniture destruction down the road. And you'll want a cozy bed, or simply a soft blanket in a low-sided box, tucked somewhere quiet. A few more items are worth having on hand, even though they're easy to overlook in the excitement of the moment. A couple of interactive toys, a wand toy, or a few small balls. Give your kitten a low-pressure way to burn off nervous energy once they're feeling brave enough to play, which for some kittens happens surprisingly early, sometimes even within the first few hours. Nail clippers designed for kittens, along with a plan to start the gentle paw handling we talked about a moment ago, are worth having ready from day one, rather than scrambling for them once you actually notice overgrown claws. And it's worth having the contact information for a local vet already saved somewhere easy to find, along with the nearest emergency animal hospital, before you need either one in a hurry. This is exactly the kind of preparation that becomes invaluable if you ever run into one of the health situations we cover in our emergency first aid guide, having the information ready before a crisis, not scrambling to find it during one. One more logistical point that trips up more new owners than you'd expect: the timing of arrival itself. If you have any flexibility in scheduling when your kitten actually comes home, a weekend or the start of a few days off tends to work out considerably better than a random weekday when you're heading straight back to work the next morning. It's not that a kitten can't adjust while you're at work, plenty do just fine. But having even 1 or 2 days of relatively uninterrupted presence during that critical first settling in window tends to smooth out the whole process, and it gives you the chance to actually observe eating, litter box use, and general demeanor closely during the most sensitive early hours, rather than coming home after a full workday to a kitten you've barely gotten to check in on. Here's the concept that matters more than almost any individual item on that list, and it's one that a lot of new owners genuinely don't know about going in: the safe room approach. Rather than letting your new kitten loose in your entire house on day one, set up one single room, a bedroom, a bathroom, a home office, anywhere reasonably small and quiet with all of their essentials, litter box, food, water, bed, a few toys, and let that be their entire world for the first few days. This might feel restrictive or even a little sad to a new owner who's excited to watch their kitten explore the whole house. But from the kitten's perspective, an entire unfamiliar house is an overwhelming amount of new territory to process all at once, full of unfamiliar smells, sounds, and hiding spots they haven't mapped yet. A single smaller space that they can fully understand and feel secure in, within a day or two, gives them a stable home base to expand outward from, rather than a huge unknown space that can leave a kitten overwhelmed, hiding, and slow to settle in. While we're on the topic of setting up that safe room, it's worth mentioning a tool a lot of experienced fosters and shelters swear by: synthetic feline facial pheromone products, which come in plug-in diffuser form or as a spray. These are designed to mimic the natural pheromones cats release when they rub their face against something, a signal that broadly communicates this place is safe and familiar to their own nervous system. Placing one of these diffusers in the safe room a day or two before your kitten arrives, if you have that kind of advance notice, gives it time to build up in the air of the room before your kitten ever steps foot in it. This isn't a magic fix, and it won't override a kitten's genuine need for time and gradual adjustment. But a lot of owners report it takes a noticeable edge off the early stress, and there's very little downside to trying it, given how inexpensive and low effort it is to set up. It's also worth thinking briefly about sound and light in the safe room itself. A room with a window that gets some natural light, rather than a windowless interior space, tends to help kittens settle into a more normal day and night rhythm faster. If the room is right next to a noisy part of the house, a laundry room, a busy hallway, a shared wall with a TV room, consider whether a slightly quieter room might serve better for these first few days, even if it's a little smaller or less convenient for you personally. The goal throughout all of this setup is minimizing unnecessary sensory load during a window, when your kitten is already processing about as much unfamiliar input as they can handle. Let's talk about the actual trip home, because this is often the first genuinely stressful experience of your kitten's life with you, and how you handle it matters. Use a proper carrier, not a cardboard box or holding the kitten loose in your lap, both for safety and because an enclosed, den-like space is actually calming for a stressed animal, giving them somewhere to feel hidden and secure rather than exposed. Line the carrier with a soft towel or blanket, ideally one that already smells like the kitten's previous environment if you have access to something like that, since familiar scent is genuinely comforting during a moment of total sensory upheaval. Keep the car ride as calm and quiet as you reasonably can. Avoid loud music. Keep conversation low and soft if you're not driving alone, and resist the urge to constantly open the carrier to check on or comfort your kitten during the drive, since that on-off cycle of exposure and enclosure can actually be more stressful than simply letting them stay contained and settled for the length of the trip. I'd love to know how your kitten's first car ride home went. Some handle it like champs, others cry the entire way, and both are completely normal reactions to a genuinely big life event. Tell us about it in the comments. It helps other new owners know what to expect and realize their own experience. Whatever it looked like probably wasn't unusual. Once you're home, resist the temptation to let your kitten explore everywhere immediately, even if you skip the safe room concept and want to reconsider it now. This is the moment to commit to it. Carry the carrier directly into the prepared safe room, close the door, and then open the carrier door and simply let your kitten choose when to come out. Don't reach in and pull them out. Don't hover directly over the carrier opening. Sit a few feet away, at their level if you can, and let curiosity do the work on their own timeline. Some kittens bound out within seconds, ready to investigate everything. Others stay tucked in the back of the carrier for 20 minutes, or even longer, working up the nerve. Both are completely normal, and neither one predicts how confident or shy your kitten will ultimately become as an adult. This is simply a stress response to an enormous change, not a permanent personality trait revealing itself. For the first few hours, your job is mostly to exist calmly in the room without pushing interaction. Let your kitten sniff around, discover the litter box, discover the food, discover you, entirely at their own pace. If they approach you, wonderful. Offer a gentle hand for them to sniff, and let them decide whether they want more contact than that. If they retreat to a hiding spot instead, and many kittens will, under the bed, behind a piece of furniture, inside a half-open closet, that's completely fine too. Let them have that space. A kitten who's actively hiding is doing exactly what their instincts are telling them to do in an unfamiliar environment, and forcing them out before they're ready almost always backfires, extending the timeline of fear rather than shortening it. This is actually a great moment to bring back something we touched on earlier. Simply sitting on the floor of the safe room, reading a book, working on your laptop, or just existing quietly nearby without demanding interaction teaches your kitten that your presence is safe and unremarkable, rather than something that requires a reaction. Some of the most successful first days involve owners who spent hours simply sitting in the same room as their new kitten, doing their own thing, letting the kitten observe them from a safe distance and gradually work up the courage to get closer. Let's talk about feeding during this window, because appetite is one of the most telling signs of how your kitten is coping emotionally, and it's worth paying close attention to. It's completely normal for a kitten to eat less than usual on the first day, sometimes barely touching their food at all, simply because stress genuinely suppresses appetite in cats the same way it does in a lot of other animals. Don't panic over a skipped meal or two, but do keep a close eye on it. If your kitten hasn't eaten anything at all within 24 hours, that's worth a call to your vet, since kittens have much less metabolic reserve than adult cats and can run into blood sugar problems faster if they go too long without food. To encourage eating during this stressful window, try warming wet food slightly to release more aroma, which cats generally find more appealing when they're stressed and less inclined to investigate food purely out of curiosity. Placing the food bowl reasonably close to wherever your kitten seems to be hiding, without hovering over them while they eat, can also help, since eating in a spot that feels exposed is the last thing a stressed kitten wants to do. Water intake matters just as much, if not more, especially in the first day or two. Make sure fresh water is always available in the safe room, and if you notice your kitten hasn't touched it at all after several hours, you might try a second water source in a different part of the room, since some kittens have location preferences that aren't obvious to us and simply won't drink from a bowl in a spot that doesn't feel right to them yet. Once your kitten has settled in and is eating reliably, usually somewhere after the first week or two, you may decide you want to transition them to a different food than whatever they arrived with, whether that's for cost reasons, availability, or simply your own preference for a particular brand or formula. When that time comes, resist the urge to make the switch all at once, even though your kitten is no longer in that acute early adjustment window. A gradual transition over 7 to 10 days, mixing in a small amount of the new food with the old and slowly increasing the ratio day by day, gives your kitten's digestive system time to adjust and dramatically reduces the odds of the loose stool or vomiting that an abrupt food change can sometimes trigger. This is a good general rule for any future food changes throughout your cat's life. Not just this initial period, but it's especially worth keeping in mind here, since a kitten's digestive system is generally more sensitive than an adult cat's to begin with. Sleep is another area where new owners sometimes worry unnecessarily. It's completely normal for a stressed kitten to sleep significantly more than usual in the first day or two, tucked away in a hiding spot rather than an open bed you've provided. This is a coping mechanism, not a red flag, and most kittens gradually shift back toward more typical sleep patterns and start using the bed you've actually set up for them within the first week as their stress levels come down and the environment starts to feel familiar rather than threatening. Now let's talk about the pacing of expanding your kitten's territory beyond the safe room, because this is where a lot of eager new owners move too fast, out of excitement rather than any real mistake in judgment. The general guideline is to wait until your kitten is clearly comfortable in the safe room, eating normally, using the litter box reliably, approaching you for attention, playing before opening the door and letting them explore one additional room at a time. For most kittens, this happens somewhere between 2 and 5 days after arrival, though some confident kittens are ready within a single day, and some more anxious ones might need closer to a week or even slightly longer in the safe room before they're truly ready to branch out. There's no universal timeline here, and rushing this stage to match some idea of what should be happening by a certain day tends to cause more setbacks than it solves. When you do start expanding their territory, do it gradually, room by room, rather than opening every door in the house at once. Let your kitten fully explore and settle into one new space before introducing the next. Keep the litter box and food in the original safe room for now, even as their explorable territory grows, since consistency in where those essentials live gives your kitten a stable anchor point, even as everything else around them is changing. Here's something I want you to pay attention to during this expansion phase, and it's a great moment for you to share your own observations with us. As your kitten explores more of the house for the first time, what have you noticed catches their attention the most? Windows, certain pieces of furniture, a particular corner they keep returning to? Let us know in the comments. It's honestly one of the more fun parts of these early days, watching a kitten's personality and preferences start to show themselves as they get more comfortable. Let's talk about what happens if you already have another cat or a dog in the household during this window, because I know a lot of you watching this aren't bringing a kitten into an empty house. We're going to cover full introduction protocols in detail later in this guide. But for these first 48 hours specifically, the short version is this. Keep your new kitten entirely separated from existing pets behind a closed door for the full duration of the safe room phase. This isn't about the animals disliking each other necessarily. It's about not stacking two enormous adjustments, a brand new environment and a brand new animal relationship on top of each other in the same fragile window. Let your new kitten fully settle into the safe room and start feeling secure there first. Scent swapping, letting existing pets sniff a blanket that's been with the new kitten and vice versa, can begin during this window. But actual face-to-face introductions should wait until your kitten has had a real chance to decompress, which usually means at least several days, sometimes considerably longer. Let's also talk about scheduling that first vet visit, because timing this well makes a real difference to how your kitten experiences it. Ideally, you want to schedule this visit for some time after the initial safe room adjustment period, rather than on day one, unless there's a specific health concern that can't wait. A kitten who seems genuinely unwell, isn't eating at all, or was acquired under circumstances where an immediate health check is warranted, like a stray with an unknown history. For a healthy kitten, settling in normally, giving them 3 to 5 days to find their footing before their first car ride and vet visit means they're going into that experience from a slightly more resilient starting point, rather than stacking an already stressful medical visit directly on top of the shock of a brand new home. That said, don't wait too long either. Most vets recommend an initial wellness check within the first week or two, regardless, both to establish a baseline for your kitten's health and to get started on or continue whatever vaccination and deworming schedule they need. If you do have any advance notice of your kitten's exact arrival date, it's worth calling ahead and getting that first appointment on the calendar. For roughly a week out, so you're not scrambling to find an opening once you're already in the thick of the adjustment period. Let's move into common issues that show up during this early window, because knowing what's normal versus what warrants concern will save you a lot of unnecessary worry. Hiding for extended periods is, as we've covered, completely normal in the first day or two. But if your kitten is still hiding almost constantly after a full week, refusing to come out even for food, that's worth a closer look and possibly a call to your vet to rule out illness, since sometimes what looks like pure stress is actually a kitten who isn't feeling well. Occasional vocalizing, crying, or meowing during the first night is common and usually just an expression of confusion and mild distress at the sudden change. Persistent, distressed crying that doesn't taper off over several days, especially paired with pacing or an inability to settle at all, is worth mentioning to your vet as well, just to rule out anything physical going on underneath the behavioral picture. Mild digestive upset, slightly softer stool for a day or two is common given the stress and change of environment, even if you've kept the food exactly the same. This usually resolves on its own within a few days. Diarrhea that persists beyond that, or that's paired with lethargy or a complete refusal to eat deserves a vet call rather than a wait-and-see approach, since kittens can dehydrate and decline faster than adult cats. Let's talk about a handful of mistakes that tend to slow down this whole process, because avoiding these matters just as much as everything we've already covered. Mistake number 1, skipping the safe room entirely because you're excited and want your kitten to see the whole house right away. I understand the impulse completely, but this is genuinely one of the most common reasons new kittens take far longer than necessary to feel settled. Resist the urge, even for just the first few days. Mistake number 2, too many visitors too soon. I know everyone wants to meet the new kitten, and we talked earlier about the value of exposure to different people, but the first 24 to 48 hours specifically are not the moment for that. Let your kitten settle with just their immediate household first, and save the friends and extended family introductions for after they've had a few calm days to find their footing. Mistake number 3, constantly picking up or handling a kitten who's still clearly stressed out of a well-meaning desire to comfort them. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do is simply let your kitten be, rather than repeatedly scooping them up for cuddles they haven't asked for. Let them come to you. Mistake number 4, changing food, litter, or bedding all at once, right at arrival, because you decided you wanted a different brand than whatever the kitten was already using. Every one of those changes on their own is manageable, but stacked together with the enormous change of a new home entirely, they add unnecessary additional stress right when your kitten can least afford it. Make any changes like that gradually over the following weeks, once your kitten is already settled. Mistake number 5, comparing your kitten's adjustment timeline to someone else's, whether that's a friend's kitten, a previous cat you owned, or some general expectation you had going in. Every kitten's personality, prior history, and pace of adjustment is genuinely different, and a kitten who takes 10 days to fully relax into their new home isn't doing anything wrong compared to one who was confidently exploring by day 2. Let your specific kitten's pace be the pace. Mistake number 6, worth mentioning specifically because it's so common and so well-intentioned, over-documenting the whole experience at the expense of actually being present for it. It's completely natural to want to photograph and video every moment of your kitten's first days, and there's nothing wrong with capturing some of it, but constantly hovering with a phone held up, especially close to a kitten who's still working through fear and uncertainty, adds another layer of unfamiliar, slightly intrusive stimulus right when they need calm predictability the most. Capture the moments that happen naturally, but try not to let the documentation itself become another source of pressure during those first sensitive days. Let's talk briefly about something that isn't strictly practical advice, but that a lot of owners find genuinely helps the bonding process during this window, establishing a few small, consistent rituals from the very start. This might be a specific phrase you always say when you enter the safe room, the same soft tone of voice each time you offer food, or a brief, gentle petting session at the same point each evening once your kitten is comfortable enough to accept it. Cats build a huge amount of their sense of security from predictable patterns, and kittens especially benefit from having a few small, repeated cues that signal safety and routine right from the very beginning, rather than every interaction feeling novel and unpredictable during a period when almost everything else already is. These rituals don't need to be elaborate. In fact, the simpler and more repeatable they are, the more effective they tend to be, since consistency is really the entire point. Before we wrap up, let's run through a few of the questions that come up constantly around this topic. How long should the safe room phase actually last? There's no fixed number of days. The real marker is behavior, not a calendar. Once your kitten is eating normally, using the litter box reliably, and showing curiosity or confidence rather than constant hiding, they're likely ready to start exploring more territory. What if my kitten won't come out of hiding at all for the first day? Completely normal, and not something to force. Leave food and water within easy reach of their hiding spot. Make sure the litter box is accessible too, and simply give them time. Most kittens start venturing out within the first 12 to 24 hours once the initial shock passes. Should I stay home from work for the first few days if I can? If your schedule allows it, a day or two of extra presence during this window can genuinely help. Not because your kitten needs constant supervision, but because a calm, familiar presence nearby while they're adjusting tends to speed up how quickly they settle. That said, plenty of kittens adjust perfectly well even when owners can't take time off. It simply may take a little longer without that extra presence in the earliest hours. Is it normal for my kitten to seem totally fine on day 1 and then more stressed on day 2 or 3? Yes, and this actually happens fairly often. The adrenaline and shock of the move itself can mask stress initially, with the fuller emotional response showing up once the immediate novelty settles and the reality of the change sets in. This dip is usually temporary and tends to resolve within the first week as your kitten continues to acclimate. Should I let my kitten sleep in my bed during these first few nights? This one really comes down to personal preference, since there's no strong behavioral argument either way for the first few nights specifically. Some owners find that allowing this early actually speeds up bonding and gives the kitten a strong sense of security, while others prefer to establish separate sleeping arrangements from the very beginning to avoid a habit they may not want long term. Whatever you decide, try to be consistent with it rather than allowing it one night and blocking it the next, since inconsistency here can create confusion during a period when your kitten is already trying to figure out what the rules and rhythms of this new environment actually are. What if my kitten seems to prefer one family member over everyone else right away? This is completely normal, especially if one person is naturally quieter, spends more time sitting calmly nearby, or happens to be the one handling feeding most consistently during these early days. It doesn't mean your kitten dislikes anyone else in the household, and it very often evens out over the following weeks as everyone gets more comfortable and consistent in how they interact. If you want to encourage a more even bond across the household, simply have other family members take turns with some of the calm, low-pressure interactions we've talked about throughout this section. Sitting nearby, offering food, letting the kitten approach on their own terms. Is it normal for my kitten to have a burst of zoomies suddenly in the middle of settling in? Yes, and it's actually a good sign. Sudden bursts of energetic play or running, sometimes called the zoomies, often show up once a kitten has decompressed enough to feel safe, releasing some of that built-up nervous energy. If you start noticing this behavior after a quiet, cautious day or two, take it as a positive signal that your kitten is beginning to feel more at ease in their new environment, not as a behavioral problem to correct. One more thing before we close this one out. If your kitten is currently going through this exact window right now, I'd genuinely like to know, how's it going? Confident explorer already, or still working up the courage to leave a hiding spot? Every story helps other new owners going through this exact same stretch right now feel a little less alone in it, so share it with us in the comments. It's also worth saying plainly, before we close this out, that none of what we've covered today requires perfection to work. You don't need to execute every single piece of this advice flawlessly for your kitten to end up happy, secure, and well bonded to you. Real households are messy, schedules don't always cooperate. Sometimes a visitor shows up on day 1 before you'd planned. Sometimes the safe room ends up being smaller or less ideal than you'd like. Kittens are, generally speaking, remarkably resilient, and the broad principles here, patience, letting them set the pace, minimizing unnecessary stacked change, matter far more than getting every single detail exactly right. Think of this less as a rigid checklist and more as a general philosophy to lean on whenever you're facing a decision during these early days, and you'll be in good shape. Trust your own read on your specific kitten over any general rule whenever the two seem to conflict, since you're the one actually watching their body language in real time. and that observation will always beat a generic timeline pulled from a video like this one. Let's bring this together into the core takeaways. Ideally, let a kitten stay with their mother and litter mates until around 12 to 13 weeks if the situation allows for it, since the extra time genuinely benefits their long-term social development. Have every supply ready before your kitten ever arrives, and commit to the safe room approach for at least the first several days, rather than opening up the whole house immediately. Keep the car ride calm and contained. Let your kitten set the pace for exploring both the room and eventually the rest of the house, and pay close attention to eating, drinking, and litter box use as your clearest signals of how the adjustment is actually going. Keep existing pets separated during this initial window. Avoid overwhelming your kitten with visitors or unnecessary changes stacked on top of the move itself. And remember that every kitten's timeline is genuinely their own. Some settle in a day, some take 2 weeks, and both outcomes are completely normal starting points for a long, happy life together. If this section was helpful, let us know in the comments where you are in this journey right now, still prepping for a kitten's arrival in the thick of the first few days, or looking back on this stage with a now fully settled cat. We touched briefly on this next topic earlier when we talked about litter mates and bite inhibition during the socialization window. Now let's go deep on that exact subject, because it's one of the most common reasons adult cats end up with a reputation for being bitey, scratchy, or aggressive during play, when in reality, almost none of that is actually aggression at all. It's a training gap from kittenhood, and it's almost entirely preventable if you know what you're doing during these early months. So let's cover exactly how to teach your kitten to play with your hands appropriately, how to build strong bite inhibition, and how to avoid raising a cat who turns every petting session into an ambush. Let's start with something that might genuinely change how you think about this whole topic. When a kitten bites or claws during play, that is not aggression in the way we typically use that word. It's predatory behavior, the exact same hardwired hunting sequence that drives a wild cat to stalk, pounce, and dispatch prey, just redirected onto whatever's moving in front of them, which very often happens to be your hand, your foot under a blanket, or your hair as you walk by. Kittens are born with this sequence essentially preloaded, and play is how they practice and refine it before they'd ever need to use it for real. The problem isn't that your kitten has this instinct. Every cat does, and trying to eliminate it entirely isn't realistic or fair to them. The problem is when that instinct gets pointed at human skin during play and never gets redirected anywhere else, because then you end up with an adult cat who's been rehearsing for months that hands are an acceptable, even fun, target for their teeth and claws. It helps to understand the actual sequence involved here, because once you can name each part of it, you'll start recognizing it happening in real time with your own kitten, which makes the whole redirection process considerably easier. Wild cats, and by extension our domestic cats who share the same underlying wiring, hunt using a 4-part behavioral sequence: stalk, chase, pounce, and bite. Sometimes with a 5th step afterward that behaviorists call the kill bite, a deeper, more sustained bite meant to actually dispatch prey. Kittens are essentially born with the hardware for this entire sequence already installed, but not yet calibrated. Watching their mother hunt and endlessly rehearsing the sequence through play with litter mates is how that calibration happens over the following weeks and months. This is precisely why play in kittens looks the way it does. The exaggerated crouch, the wiggling hindquarters right before a pounce, the sudden explosive charge toward a moving object. None of that is random. It's a young predator running through the exact same behavioral program their wild ancestors relied on for survival, just with nothing at stake except a toy, or unfortunately, your hand. Understanding this also explains why simply telling a kitten no, or trying to suppress the instinct altogether, doesn't really work as a long-term strategy. You're not dealing with a behavior a kitten chooses to engage in and could just as easily choose not to, the way a human might decide not to interrupt someone. You're working with a deeply hardwired survival instinct that's going to express itself one way or another. The entire goal of everything we're covering today isn't suppression, it's redirection, giving that instinct an appropriate, satisfying outlet so it doesn't default to your hands simply because nothing better was available in the moment. This is why the single most important rule in this entire section is one you'll hear repeated constantly throughout. From the very first time you play with your kitten, never use your bare hands or fingers as a toy. I know it's tempting. Wiggling your fingers under a blanket or letting a kitten pounce and gently bite your hand during play feels harmless and even sweet when they're 8 weeks old and weigh next to nothing. But you're not just playing in that moment. You're actively teaching your kitten that human hands are a legitimate object to hunt, bite, and claw. That lesson doesn't expire when the kitten grows up. A 4-month-old kitten with that same well-practiced habit has much sharper teeth, much stronger jaws, and considerably more force behind every pounce. And a lot of owners find themselves genuinely surprised and hurt a few months down the line by a habit they personally taught their cat to have. Let's talk about the actual mechanics of teaching proper bite inhibition, because this is where the real coaching happens. The first pillar is redirection, and it's the single most powerful tool you have. Every single time you want to play with your kitten, use a toy, not your hands, to initiate and carry out that play. A wand toy with feathers or fabric on the end, attached to a string, keeps a meaningful distance between your hand and your kitten's teeth and claws while still letting them engage in that full predatory sequence. The stalk, the crouch, the pounce, the bite, and importantly, the release, since real prey wouldn't stick around to keep being bitten. Small toy mice, balls, or crinkle toys that you toss for your kitten to chase also work well, giving them a target that isn't attached to you at all. If you want to play a game that involves your kitten pouncing on something near your hand, put a sock over your hand, or use a larger stuffed toy that you move around rather than your bare skin. The principle throughout all of this is the same. Your kitten gets to fully express and practice their predatory instincts, which is genuinely important for their development and their mental well-being, just never with your actual hands as the target. Let's get a little more specific about toy selection, since not all toys serve this. Redirection purpose equally well. Wand toys with a long handle are particularly valuable precisely because of the physical distance they create between your hand and your kitten's mouth, letting you actively participate in play, moving the toy in prey like patterns, darting, pausing, retreating into hiding, without ever putting your fingers within striking range. Look for wand toys with feathers, fabric strips, or fake fur attached, since these tend to trigger stronger predatory interest than plain plastic attachments, likely because the texture and movement more closely resembles actual prey. Rotate a few different wand toys so your kitten doesn't lose interest in any single one, and store them somewhere your kitten can't access unsupervised, both to keep them novel and because the strings and small attached parts can pose a genuine safety risk if chewed on and swallowed outside of supervised play. Standalone toys that don't require your direct involvement, small toy mice, crinkle balls, catnip-filled pouches, are also worth having in rotation, particularly for moments when you can't actively engage in a full wand toy session, but still want to give your kitten an appropriate outlet. Tossing one of these across the room and letting your kitten chase, pounce, and mock kill it independently satisfies a lot of that same predatory drive, even without your direct participation. One category worth a specific mention: laser pointers. These are wildly popular and undeniably captivate most cats, but they come with a real limitation worth understanding. A laser dot can never actually be caught, which means the predatory sequence never reaches its natural, satisfying conclusion, the pounce and capture that normally signals to a cat's nervous system that the hunt is over. Cats who play primarily or exclusively with laser pointers can sometimes become genuinely frustrated over time, since they're perpetually chasing something they can never physically catch. If you do use a laser pointer, it's worth ending every single session by redirecting your kitten onto a toy they actually can catch and hold, a toy mouse or a wand toy, so the hunting sequence gets to complete properly before the session ends. The second pillar is teaching a clear, consistent consequence the moment a bite happens, even a gentle one. If your hand does end up in contact during play, if your kitten bites down on your hand, even softly, the correct response is to immediately go still and stop all movement rather than pulling your hand away quickly. This might sound counterintuitive since your instinct is to yank back, but a sudden pulling motion actually mimics fleeing prey, which triggers more biting and chasing, not less. Instead, freeze completely. Let your hand go limp and boring and say a short, calm word like ouch or no in a flat, unexcited tone. Then immediately withdraw attention entirely, standing up and walking away or turning your back for a minute or two. You're not punishing your kitten, you're simply removing the reward, which in this case is your continued engagement and movement. Cats, and especially kittens, learn very efficiently from this kind of natural consequence. Biting makes the fun stop, much more effectively than they learn from any kind of verbal scolding or physical correction. I want to hear how this has gone for you so far, if you've already been working on this with your own kitten. Has the freeze and withdraw approach made a noticeable difference? Or is your kitten still testing the boundaries? Let us know in the comments, since hearing real timelines from other owners tends to help people feel less discouraged if progress seems slow in the first week or two. The third pillar is learning to read the warning signs that come before a bite, because a lot of what looks like a sudden, unprovoked bite is actually the tail end of a buildup that had clear signals the whole way through, if you know what to look for. Watch for a tail that starts twitching or lashing, ears that rotate sideways or flatten slightly, pupils that dilate even in normal lighting, and a body that goes still and low right before a pounce. These are all part of the natural predatory sequence building toward a strike. Once you can recognize this buildup, you can interrupt it before it reaches your hand by tossing a toy to redirect that building energy onto an appropriate target instead. Over time, you'll start to develop a genuinely good read on your own kitten's specific tells, since every cat telegraphs this sequence slightly differently. The fourth pillar is making sure your kitten is getting enough appropriate outlets for this instinct throughout the day, not just during dedicated play sessions. A kitten who's understimulated, without enough opportunities to stalk, chase, and pounce on appropriate targets, tends to seek out that stimulation wherever they can find it, and your ankles walking down the hallway or your hand resting on the couch become very tempting substitutes. Aim for at least 2 or 3 dedicated play sessions a day, each running 10 to 15 minutes, using wand toys or chase toys, ideally timed to end with your kitten actually catching and mock-killing their toy, since ending play abruptly mid-hunt without that satisfying capture can leave a kitten wound up with nowhere for that energy to go. Rotating toys every few days so they stay novel and interesting also helps keep your kitten genuinely engaged during these sessions rather than losing interest halfway through. Let's talk about something that trips up a lot of owners: the difference between play biting and what's sometimes called petting, induced aggression, or overstimulation biting, because the causes and the fixes are actually quite different, even though both result in teeth on your hand. Play biting, which is what we've been discussing so far, happens during active play, usually involves a full body pounce or chase sequence leading up to it, and is fundamentally about predatory instinct. Overstimulation biting, on the other hand, tends to happen during a calm petting session that's gone on a little too long, and it's actually a sensory issue, not a hunting instinct at all. A cat's skin has a genuine threshold for how much repetitive touch feels good before it starts to feel like too much. And once that threshold is crossed, the nervous system essentially flips from pleasant to overwhelming, and a bite or swat becomes the cat's way of communicating that shift. sometimes with surprisingly little warning if you haven't learned their specific signals yet. The warning signs here look a little different from the predatory buildup we just covered. Watch for skin rippling along the back, a tail that starts to thump or flick even though the cat still seems relatively relaxed otherwise, ears that swivel back briefly, or a head turned toward your hand that isn't quite an affectionate nuzzle. The fix here isn't redirection with a toy. Since the issue isn't a lack of appropriate outlet, it's simply stopping the petting before the threshold gets crossed. Learn your specific kitten's tolerance, which might be 30 seconds for one cat and 5 minutes for another, and end petting sessions proactively on your terms before they end involuntarily on your kitten's terms with a bite. This actually builds trust over time, since a kitten who learns that petting reliably stops before it becomes overwhelming tends to relax into it more fully during the time it does last, rather than staying slightly braced the whole time out of uncertainty about when it'll go too far. If you've noticed this specific pattern with your own cat, the overstimulation bite rather than the play bite, I'd love to know what your kitten's particular threshold seems to be and where on their body seems most sensitive. Base of the tail and belly tend to be common trouble spots for a lot of cats, but every individual is different. And sharing what you've noticed in the comments genuinely helps other owners figure out what to watch for with their own cat. Let's also touch on claws specifically, since a lot of what we've covered so far focuses on biting, but scratching during play follows a lot of the same underlying logic and calls for a similar approach. A kitten who paws or scratches at your hand during play is running the same predatory sequence, just expressing it through their claws rather than their teeth. And the redirection principle applies identically. Toys, instead of hands, freeze and withdraw if contact happens, and recognizing the buildup before it escalates. It's worth pairing this training with the gentle paw handling exercises we covered earlier, since a kitten who's already comfortable having their paws touched and examined tends to be considerably easier to manage in moments when you do need to gently move a paw away from your hand during an overly enthusiastic play session. Regular nail. Trims also meaningfully reduce the consequences of any accidental scratches that do happen, while this whole process is still a work in progress. Keeping your kitten's claws trimmed short doesn't teach bite inhibition or reduce the underlying instinct at all, but it does turn an accidental scratch from a genuinely painful scrape into a much more minor, forgettable moment, which matters both for your own comfort during this training period and for keeping every interaction as positive as possible, while the deeper lesson is still sinking in. Let's talk about multi-kitten households, because if you've got 2 kittens, or a kitten and a young resident cat close in age, play biting between them actually serves an important function. We touched on briefly earlier, litter mates and playmates provide real-time feedback that humans simply can't replicate as effectively. A kitten who bites a sibling too hard during play gets an immediate, unambiguous response. A yelp, a hiss, an abrupt end to the game, sometimes a firm retaliatory nip, and that feedback loop is remarkably effective at teaching bite inhibition, often more effective than anything we can do as humans. If you have 2 kittens together, you'll usually notice their play naturally moderates in intensity over the following weeks as they calibrate to each other. And this generally translates well into gentler play with humans too, since the underlying lesson, don't bite too hard or the fun stops, transfers across contexts reasonably well. That said, don't assume a kitten with a playmate needs zero guidance from you specifically when it comes to how they interact with human hands. The lesson from littermates teaches bite inhibition in general, meaning how hard is genuinely too hard, but it doesn't automatically teach that hands specifically are off limits as a target, since obviously their sibling isn't a hand. You'll still want to apply the redirection and freeze and withdraw techniques we've covered whenever play with you specifically involves your kitten going for your hands, even if their play with a sibling looks appropriately gentle. Let's talk about a handful of mistakes that tend to undo good bite inhibition training, because avoiding these matters just as much as everything positive we've covered. Mistake number 1, inconsistency. which is probably the single biggest derailer of this entire process. If you sometimes let your kitten bite and claw at your hands because you're in a playful mood and it seems cute in the moment, and other times you correct the exact same behavior, your kitten receives a genuinely confusing, mixed signal about what's actually allowed. This applies across the whole household too, not just you individually. If one person roughhouses with bare hands regularly, while another consistently redirects to toys, your kitten is essentially getting two different sets of rules depending on who they're with, which makes the whole learning process considerably slower and messier for everyone. Mistake number 2, physical punishment in response to a bite, whether that's a flick on the nose, a swat, yelling, or any kind of physical correction. This doesn't teach bite inhibition, and it actively works against building trust with your kitten. What it does teach, often quite effectively, is that hands are unpredictable and can be a source of pain, which can make a kitten more defensive and more likely to bite preemptively out of fear rather than less likely to bite at all. The freeze and withdraw method we covered earlier works specifically because it removes the reward of continued play without introducing any element of fear or pain into the interaction. Mistake number 3, playing too roughly with a young kitten in a way that ramps up their arousal level past the point where they can make good decisions about bite pressure. Fast, chaotic, high-energy play sessions, especially involving your hands moving quickly and unpredictably, tend to escalate a kitten's excitement to a point where their bite inhibition essentially goes out the window entirely, not because they've forgotten the lesson, but because an overstimulated kitten simply isn't operating with the same level of control as a calm one. Keep play sessions energetic but not chaotic. And if you notice your kitten getting increasingly frantic rather than focused during a session, that's a good moment to wind things down rather than push further. Mistake number 4, giving up. On toy redirection too early because it feels slower or less immediately engaging than just letting your kitten play with your hands directly. This is genuinely one of the more common reasons bite inhibition training stalls out. It's true that toy play sometimes requires more effort on your part, moving the toy, keeping the session interesting, compared to just letting a kitten gnaw on your finger while you watch TV. But the investment pays off enormously by the time your kitten is a fully grown cat with adult strength and adult teeth, and the habits you build now are considerably easier to establish than they are to unwind later. Mistake number 5. Ignoring the warning signs entirely and only reacting once an actual bite has already happened. The most effective bite inhibition training doesn't just correct after the fact, it prevents the bite from happening in the first place by recognizing the buildup and redirecting early. If you find yourself constantly surprised by bites that seem to come out of nowhere, it's worth spending a session or two purely observing your kitten's body language during play, without necessarily trying to correct anything, just to build your own fluency in reading their specific signals before they escalate. Mistake number 6, expecting the exact same rules and responses to work identically as your kitten grows from 8 weeks to 8 months without adjusting your approach as their strength, coordination, and life stage change. A tiny 8-week-old kitten's bite genuinely doesn't hurt much, and it's tempting to be more lenient about hand play during this stage simply because the physical consequences feel minor. But every rule you're lax about at 8 weeks becomes a habit you're fighting against at 4 months, once the same behavior comes with considerably more force behind it. The kindest, most effective approach is actually to apply the full redirection and freeze and withdraw protocol from the very first play session, even when the bites are genuinely harmless, precisely because you're building a habit for the cat your kitten is going to become, not just managing the cat they are today. Let's talk about timing and what a realistic path forward actually looks like, because I don't want to leave you with the impression that this fixes itself in a day or two. Progress here is rarely linear, and it's worth setting that expectation clearly right from the start. Most kittens show meaningful improvement in bite pressure and hand targeting within 2 to 4 weeks of consistent redirection and freeze and withdraw responses, assuming the whole household is applying the same approach. Full, reliable bite inhibition, meaning a cat who has genuinely internalized that human hands are not appropriate targets even during high excitement, tends to solidify somewhere between 4 and 6 months of age, though this varies meaningfully by individual cat. Some kittens seem to get it almost immediately, others take considerably longer, and a kitten who came from a background with less litter-mate interaction, which we discussed earlier, may need extra patience and extra repetitions before this fully clicks. If your kitten came from a background with a genuinely rough start, an orphaned litter, an early separation from mom and siblings, or an unknown history entirely, it's worth going into this process expecting a longer runway and being especially deliberate about consistency, since these kittens often missed out on exactly the kind of natural, real-time feedback that litter mates provide so effectively. This doesn't mean the outcome will be worse. Plenty of kittens with rough starts grow into perfectly gentle, well-mannered adult cats. It simply means the human-led version of this training is doing more of the heavy lifting than it would for a kitten who had a full, typical litter experience. So give yourself and your kitten extra grace and extra time if progress feels slower than what you're hearing from other owners in a similar stage. It's also worth mentioning that spaying or neutering, which most vets recommend somewhere between 4 and 6 months of age, depending on your specific cat and your vet's guidance, can have a modest calming effect on overall activity and intensity levels in some cats, particularly in males, though it's not a substitute for the training we've covered today and shouldn't be relied on as a fix on its own. Think of it as one small factor among many that can influence how this whole process unfolds, rather than something that will resolve biting issues by itself. It's also worth saying plainly that even a well-trained adult cat may occasionally nip during an especially exciting play session. And that's not necessarily a training failure. It's simply an animal with genuine predatory instincts operating at the edge of their excitement threshold. The goal of everything we've covered today isn't a cat who never once touches your hand with their teeth for the rest of their life. It's a cat with strong, reliable bite inhibition, meaning any accidental contact is gentle and controlled rather than a hard, damaging bite. Plus a cat who's been thoroughly taught that hands specifically aren't the primary target for their hunting instincts. Before we wrap up, let's run through a few of the questions that come up most often around this specific topic. What if my kitten only bites during certain times of day, like right before bed? This is extremely common, and it usually points to a kitten who's building up excess energy throughout the day with nowhere appropriate to release it, often coinciding with their natural crepuscular activity, peaks around dawn and dusk. Scheduling a dedicated, vigorous toy play session right before that predictable window, tiring them out with an appropriate outlet before the energy would otherwise get directed at your hands or feet, often solves this pattern within a week or two. Is it normal for my kitten to specifically target feet and ankles rather than hands? Yes, and this often happens because feet moving under a blanket or walking past at ankle height closely mimic the movement pattern of small prey in a way that's genuinely enticing to a hunting instinct. The same redirection principles apply here. Avoid walking past in a way that seems to invite an ambush if you know a particular hallway or doorway has become a favorite hunting spot, and make sure your kitten has plenty of appropriate outlets for that same instinct earlier in the day. My kitten seems to bite harder when I'm the one playing versus other family members. What's going on there? This sometimes happens simply because different people have different play styles, movement speeds, and consistency in applying redirection and freeze and withdraw responses, and kittens pick up on these differences quickly. It's worth having an honest look at your own play session specifically. Are you moving your hands quickly? Are you consistently redirecting to toys? Are you following through on freeze and withdraw every single time? Since small inconsistencies in your own approach can genuinely explain a pattern like this. Can adult cats still learn better bite inhibition if this wasn't addressed properly as a kitten? Absolutely, though it generally takes more patience and more consistent repetition than it would have as a kitten, simply because the habit has had more time to become established. All the same core techniques apply: toy redirection, freeze and withdraw, recognizing warning signs. They just may take a longer runway to produce the same results in an adult cat compared to a young kitten still in active development. Does declawing solve this problem? No, and it's worth addressing directly since it sometimes comes up as a proposed shortcut. Declawing is a surgical amputation of the last bone of each toe, not a simple nail removal, and it's associated with genuine, lasting physical and behavioral consequences, including chronic pain and, in some cases, an increase in biting specifically, since a cat who's lost their primary defensive tool through their claws may compensate by relying more heavily on their teeth instead. The training approach we've covered today addresses the actual root of the behavior without any of those downsides, and it's the approach genuinely recommended by veterinary behaviorists across the board. What if my kitten bites during grooming, like when I'm brushing them, rather than during obvious play? This usually falls under the overstimulation category we discussed earlier rather than predatory play, especially if it happens after several minutes of otherwise calm brushing. Watch for the same warning signs: tail flicking, skin rippling, and keep grooming sessions shorter than your kitten's apparent threshold, gradually building up duration over time as they become more comfortable with the sensation and routine. One last thing before we close. This one out. If you're currently in the middle of working on this with your own kitten, I'd genuinely like to know what's worked best for you so far and what your kitten's favorite redirect toy has turned out to be. Every cat seems to have their own particular obsession, whether that's a feather wand, a certain crinkly ball, or something completely unexpected, and hearing what's worked in real households genuinely helps other owners find something that clicks faster for their own kitten too. Share it with us in the comments. Let's bring this together into the core takeaways for this section, since we've covered a lot of genuinely useful ground. Never use your bare hands as a toy during play, from the very first session onward, since this single habit shapes everything else that follows and is genuinely the foundation everything else in this section builds on. Redirect all play onto appropriate toys. Use the freeze and withdraw response consistently the moment a bite happens, and learn to read your kitten's specific warning signs so you can redirect before a bite occurs rather than only reacting afterward, which is always the more effective approach in the long run. Make sure your kitten has enough appropriate outlets for their predatory instincts throughout the day, not just during formal play sessions, and keep the whole household consistent in applying these same principles, since mixed signals slow the whole process down considerably and can genuinely undo weeks of otherwise good progress. Understand the difference between play biting and overstimulation biting, since they call for different responses and never resort to physical punishment, which damages trust without actually teaching the lesson you're going for, no matter how satisfying it might feel in a frustrated moment. Give this process real time, generally weeks rather than days, and remember that even a well-trained adult cat may occasionally nip during exciting play, which isn't a failure. It's simply a predator with genuine, healthy instincts, channeled appropriately the vast majority of the time. Keep your kitten's claws trimmed throughout this whole process, too, since it makes every accidental scratch along the way a much smaller deal for everyone involved, you included. If this section was useful, let us know in the comments how old your kitten is right now and how this whole process has been going for you so far. It genuinely helps us understand where most of you are in this journey. One last reflection before we move on to our final topic. It's easy, in the middle of a frustrating week of redirected bites and freeze and withdraw responses, to start wondering if something's wrong with your kitten specifically, or whether you're doing this whole thing incorrectly. In almost every case, neither is true. You're simply in the middle of a completely normal developmental process, one that every single kitten goes through in some form. And the fact that you're being deliberate and consistent about it now is exactly what sets up a lifetime of gentle, trusting interaction between the two of you. The kittens who never get this training at all are the ones who tend to grow into cats with a real reputation for being bitey or unpredictable during play. Not because they're fundamentally different animals, but because nobody ever gave that natural predatory instinct anywhere appropriate to go. And by the time anyone notices the pattern, it's often been rehearsed for months already, which makes it considerably harder to unwind than it would have been to prevent from the start. You're doing the right thing, even on the days it doesn't feel like it. And the fact that you sought this information out at all already puts you ahead of a huge share of new kitten owners who never think about any of this until the biting habit is already well established. Let's move to our final topic, and it's one that's genuinely uncomfortable to think about, but that every single kitten owner needs to have a handle on before it's ever actually needed. Recognizing and responding to your kitten's first health emergencies. This isn't meant to scare you, and it's not meant to turn you into a substitute for a veterinarian. It's meant to make sure that if something does go wrong, and statistically, at some point in a young cat's life, something usually does, you're not scrambling to figure out what's serious and what isn't in the middle of a genuinely stressful moment when clear thinking matters most and is hardest to come by. So let's walk through exactly what to watch for, what to do, and just as importantly, what not to do. Before we get into specific emergencies, let's talk about preparation, because the single biggest factor in how well an emergency goes isn't luck. It's whether you were ready before it happened. If you haven't already, save the number for your regular vet somewhere you'll actually find it in a panic, not buried in an old text thread. Also, find and save the number and address of the nearest emergency animal hospital that handles after-hours care, since a lot of regular vet clinics simply aren't open at 2 in the morning, and knowing exactly where to go, rather than searching for it while your kitten is in distress, can genuinely save critical minutes. If you want a resource that walks through exactly this kind of preparation and response in detail, specifically for senior and disabled indoor cats but with a lot of overlapping principles, our Emergency First Aid Guide covers this in depth, and it's linked below if that's something you want to have on hand permanently rather than just for this one video. Let's talk about building a basic kitten first aid kit, since having the right supplies within easy reach matters just as much as knowing what to do with them. You'll want gauze pads and self-adhesive bandage wrap for controlling bleeding from a wound. A digital rectal thermometer, specifically designed for pets, since a normal human thermometer isn't ideal, and a cat's normal body temperature range runs meaningfully higher than ours anyway, generally somewhere between 100 and 102.5 degrees Fahrenheit. Hydrogen peroxide, but only ever used under direct veterinary instruction to induce vomiting. Never on your own judgment, since inducing vomiting incorrectly or with the wrong substance already ingested can actually cause serious additional harm. A pet-safe saline solution for flushing wounds or eyes. A soft towel or blanket for wrapping and restraining a distressed kitten safely during transport. And a small, sturdy carrier that's always accessible, not buried in a closet, since we talked earlier about keeping the carrier out as a normal part of the furniture. And this is exactly the kind of situation where that habit pays off. Let's talk about baseline vital signs, because knowing what's normal for your kitten is genuinely the only way to recognize what's abnormal when it actually matters most. A healthy kitten's resting heart rate generally falls somewhere between 140 and 220 beats per minute, considerably faster than an adult cat's resting rate, and their breathing rate at rest should be somewhere around 20 to 30 breaths per minute. Gum color is one of the most useful, low-tech indicators available to you at home. Healthy gums should be a consistent bubblegum pink, and pressing gently on the gum with your finger should show the color return within about 2 seconds after you release. A check often called capillary refill time. Pale, white, blue-tinged, or yellowish gums are all signs of a genuine emergency, indicating problems ranging from shock and poor circulation to oxygen deprivation to liver issues, and any of these colors warrants an immediate call to your vet or emergency clinic, not a wait-and-see approach. It's worth actually practicing checking your kitten's gums, breathing rate, and general demeanor when they're healthy and calm, simply so you have a real baseline to compare against later. A kitten who seems a little off can be hard to properly assess if you've genuinely never checked their gum color or counted their breathing rate before. And the middle of an emergency is not the moment you want to be learning what normal even looks like for the first time. It's also worth understanding what a fever actually looks like in a kitten, since it's a signal that often gets missed simply because owners aren't sure what they're looking for beyond a general sense that something seems off. A temperature above roughly 103 degrees Fahrenheit is generally considered a fever in cats. And you'll often notice accompanying signs like lethargy, reduced appetite, warm ears, and a kitten who seeks out cooler surfaces to lie on, like a bathroom floor or tile, rather than their usual cozy spots. A mild, brief fever isn't automatically an emergency on its own, but it does warrant a call to your vet and a fever above 106 degrees, or one paired with other. Concerning symptoms we've covered today, like difficulty breathing or lethargy, severe enough that your kitten won't respond normally to being picked up, does warrant urgent care. Let's get into the specific categories of emergencies you're most likely to encounter as a kitten owner, starting with the ones that require the most immediate action. Difficulty breathing is one of the most serious signs you can observe, and it always warrants an immediate trip to the vet or emergency clinic. No exceptions. Watch for open mouth breathing, which is genuinely abnormal in cats outside of extreme heat or stress, exaggerated movement of the chest or abdomen with each breath, breathing with the neck extended and head held low, or a persistent rapid breathing rate well above the normal range we just covered. Cats are remarkably good at masking respiratory distress until it's fairly advanced, which means visible difficulty breathing often indicates the situation is already serious, not an early warning sign you have time to sit with. Choking is another true emergency, and recognizing it quickly and correctly matters enormously for the outcome. Signs include pawing frantically at the mouth, gagging, retching without producing anything, drooling excessively, or a kitten who seems panicked and unable to make normal sounds. If you can see the object lodged and it's easily reachable, you may be able to carefully remove it yourself, but never blindly sweep your finger into your kitten's mouth if you can't clearly see the obstruction, since this can push it further down or cause additional injury. If the object isn't easily visible and reachable, and your kitten seems to be losing consciousness or is unable to breathe at all, a modified version of the Heimlich maneuver, adapted specifically for small animals, can be performed, though this is genuinely something worth learning from a hands-on pet first aid class or a video demonstration from a veterinary source beforehand, rather than attempting for the very first time during an actual emergency with no prior practice. Let's talk about eye injuries specifically, since kittens, with their tendency to investigate everything face first and play roughly with each other and with objects around the house, are genuinely prone to eye-related incidents, whether that's a scratch from a sibling's claw during play, an irritant like dust or a cleaning product, or a foreign object like a piece of plant material. Signs of an eye injury or irritation include excessive blinking or squinting, visible redness, discharge, cloudiness over the surface of the eye, or your kitten pawing repeatedly at one eye specifically. For minor irritation, gently flushing the eye with a pet-safe saline solution can help, but any injury involving visible trauma to the eye itself, a cloudy or bulging appearance, or a kitten who seems to be in significant pain and won't let you near the area, needs veterinary attention promptly, since eye injuries can worsen quickly, and some conditions can threaten vision permanently if treatment is delayed even by a day or two. Let's talk about poisoning, because kittens, with their intense curiosity and tendency to investigate everything with their mouths, are at particular risk here. And the range of household items that are toxic to cats is genuinely wider than most new owners expect. Common culprits include lilies, which are severely toxic to cats even in small amounts like pollen, brushing against fur that then gets groomed off, chocolate, especially dark chocolate, xylitol, an artificial sweetener found in some sugar-free gum, and baked goods, human medications including over-the-counter pain relievers like ibuprofen and acetaminophen, essential oils, particularly tea tree oil in certain diffuser blends, antifreeze, which has a sweet taste that can actually attract curious pets, and certain common houseplants beyond lilies, including sago palm, which is highly toxic to the liver. If you suspect your kitten has ingested something toxic, do not wait to see if symptoms develop before acting. Call your vet, an emergency animal hospital, or a dedicated pet poison control hotline immediately, and be ready to describe exactly what was ingested and roughly how much, since this information genuinely changes the treatment approach. Never induce vomiting unless you're specifically instructed to do so by a veterinary professional, since some substances, particularly anything caustic or petroleum-based, cause additional serious damage on the way back up, and inducing vomiting in these cases can make the situation considerably worse rather than better. There's another category of ingestion emergency worth mentioning, specifically because it's so common in kittens and so easy to underestimate: linear foreign bodies, meaning string, thread, ribbon, tinsel, or yarn. Kittens are notoriously drawn to these objects precisely because of how they move, but swallowing string is genuinely dangerous in a way that's not always intuitive. As the intestines contract to move the string along, the string itself can saw through the intestinal wall from the inside, or cause a section of intestine to bunch up like an accordion around it, both of which are serious, sometimes life-threatening complications requiring emergency surgery. If you notice string hanging from your kitten's mouth or rear end, do not pull on it, no matter how tempting that immediate fix feels, since pulling can cause severe internal damage if the string is caught on something inside. Instead, leave the visible portion alone and get to a vet immediately. This is also a strong argument for keeping string, ribbon, and similar linear items entirely out of reach during unsupervised time, rather than assuming a kitten will simply lose interest. I'd love to know, before we move on, have you already kitten-proofed your home for common toxins like these? It's a great thing to double-check, even if you think you already have, since it's surprisingly easy to overlook something like a lily in a bouquet a guest brought over, or a dropped pill from your own medication. Let us know in the comments if you've had a close call or a toxin scare with your own kitten, since hearing real examples genuinely helps other owners think through their own homes with fresh eyes. Let's talk about trauma, since kittens, being small, curious, and not always great judges of their own physical limits, are genuinely prone to accidental injury. Falls from heights, being accidentally stepped on, getting a paw or tail caught in a closing door, or being startled into a collision with furniture are all common scenarios. After any trauma, even if your kitten seems to walk it off and act normal within a few minutes, it's worth monitoring closely for the following 24 hours, since some internal injuries, particularly to organs, don't show obvious symptoms immediately. Watch for limping that doesn't resolve, reluctance to jump or climb when they normally would, pain when touched in a specific area, lethargy that doesn't match their usual energy level, or any vomiting or loss of appetite following the incident. If your kitten seems genuinely unable to bear weight on a limb, is crying out in apparent pain, or has any visible deformity that warrants an immediate vet visit rather than a wait-and-see approach. Let's talk about temperature extremes, since kittens regulate body temperature less efficiently than adult cats, and both hypothermia and hyperthermia can escalate faster in a young animal. Signs of hypothermia, meaning a body temperature that's dropped too low, include shivering, lethargy, cold ears, and paws to the touch, and in more severe cases, confusion or a body that feels cold throughout. If you suspect hypothermia, wrap your kitten in a warm, dry towel or blanket, and if available, a heating pad set on low with a towel barrier between it and your kitten. Never direct contact, and get to a vet promptly, since severe hypothermia is genuinely life-threatening. Hyperthermia, or overheating, shows up as excessive panting, drooling, bright red gums, and lethargy or collapse, and is particularly a risk if a kitten has been in a hot car, even briefly, or a room without adequate ventilation on a hot day. If you suspect overheating, move your kitten to a cool area immediately. Offer cool, not ice cold, water, and apply cool, damp towels to their paws and ears while you get to a vet, since rapid, uncontrolled cooling can actually cause its own complications. It's worth mentioning prevention specifically here, too, since heat stroke and overheating incidents are almost entirely avoidable with a little awareness. Never leave a kitten in a parked car, even briefly and even with windows cracked, since interior temperatures climb far faster than most people expect, even on days that don't feel especially hot outside. Be cautious about carriers left in direct sunlight, and during particularly hot weather, make sure your kitten always has access to shade, ventilation, and fresh water, particularly if you live somewhere with a hot climate or don't have reliable air conditioning throughout your home. Let's talk about a category that's specific to kittens because of their particular curiosity and small size: electrical cord injuries and burns. Kittens exploring a new home, especially during that territory expansion phase we discussed earlier, sometimes chew on electrical cords, which can cause burns to the mouth, and in more serious cases, can lead to fluid buildup in the lungs from the shock itself. A genuinely life-threatening complication that isn't always obvious immediately after the incident. If you witness your kitten biting into a live cord, unplug the source immediately before touching your kitten, both for their safety and yours. Then check for visible burns around the mouth, drooling, or difficulty breathing, and get to a vet promptly even if the immediate injury looks minor, since the internal effects of electrical shock aren't always visible on the surface. This is also a strong argument for cord covers or cord management solutions in any room your kitten has access to, particularly during those early months when everything in the environment is still novel and worth investigating with their mouth. Let's talk about a situation that's specific to young male cats in particular, and that genuinely constitutes a true emergency every single time it occurs, without exception: urinary blockage. If you notice your kitten straining repeatedly in the litter box, producing little to no urine despite clear effort, crying out while attempting to urinate, or excessively licking at their genital area, this requires an emergency vet visit immediately, not a same-day or next-day appointment. A blocked urethra, which happens more often in male cats due to their narrower anatomy, can become fatal within as little as 24 to 48 hours if left untreated, since the kitten becomes unable to eliminate toxins that build up rapidly in their bloodstream. This is genuinely one of the situations where erring heavily on the side of caution, even if it turns out to be a false alarm, is always the right call. Let's talk about seizures, since witnessing one in your own kitten can be genuinely frightening if you don't know what you're looking at. A seizure might involve full-body convulsing, paddling limb movements, loss of consciousness, drooling, or disorientation afterward. During a seizure, do not try to restrain your kitten or put anything in their mouth, both of which are outdated pieces of advice that can actually cause injury to you or your kitten. Instead, clear the immediate area of anything they could injure themselves on. Time the duration of the seizure if you're able to, and once it ends, keep your kitten calm and quiet while you contact your vet. A single brief seizure followed by full recovery still warrants a vet visit to investigate the underlying cause, and multiple seizures in a short period or a seizure lasting more than a few minutes is a true emergency requiring immediate care, not a wait and observe situation. Let's talk about bleeding and wounds, since these range enormously in severity, and knowing how to assess that range matters. For minor cuts or scrapes, gently clean the area and apply light pressure with clean gauze until bleeding stops. Then monitor for signs of infection over the following days: redness, swelling, discharge, or your kitten excessively licking at the area. For more significant wounds with heavier bleeding, apply firm, direct pressure with a clean cloth or gauze, and maintain that pressure continuously during transport to the vet, rather than repeatedly checking whether it's stopped, since lifting the pressure interrupts the clotting process. Any deep puncture wound, any wound that won't stop bleeding after several minutes of firm pressure, or any wound involving the eyes, abdomen, or chest needs immediate veterinary attention regardless of how it initially appears. Let's talk about a category that's less dramatic but still genuinely important to recognize: severe lethargy paired with vomiting or diarrhea. We touched on mild temporary digestive upset earlier as a normal, short-lived response to stress, but there's a real distinction worth drawing here. Occasional vomiting or slightly loose stool that resolves within a day or two in a kitten who otherwise seems bright, alert, and interested in food generally isn't an emergency. But vomiting or diarrhea that's persistent, that's paired with visible lethargy, a refusal to eat or drink, or that includes blood, warrants a same-day vet visit at minimum, since kittens dehydrate considerably faster than adult cats and can decline quickly once that starts happening, sometimes within just a matter of hours rather than days. Let's pause here for a moment, because I know this has been a heavier section than usual, and I want to check in with all of you. Have you already been through one of these emergency situations with your own kitten? If you're comfortable sharing, I think it genuinely helps other new owners watching this to hear how it played out and what you learned from it, even if it turned out to be less serious than it initially felt in the moment. Let's talk about a handful of mistakes that tend to make emergency situations worse rather than better, because avoiding these matters just as much as recognizing the emergencies themselves. And honestly, some of these are more common and more understandable than you might expect from otherwise careful, attentive owners. Mistake number 1, waiting to see if symptoms improve on their own before calling anyone, particularly with the true emergencies we've covered today: difficulty breathing, urinary blockage, choking, or suspected poisoning. With genuine emergencies, time is often the single factor that determines outcome, and a delay of even a few hours can meaningfully change the prognosis. When in doubt, call your vet or an emergency line and describe what you're seeing, even if you're not certain it warrants a visit. Most vets and emergency clinics are genuinely happy to help you triage over the phone, and it costs you nothing to ask. Mistake number 2, searching the internet for a diagnosis instead of calling a professional. It's an understandable instinct in a stressful moment, but general searches tend to surface the most alarming possible explanations, regardless of how likely they actually are, which can either cause unnecessary panic or, just as dangerously, false reassurance, if the search happens to turn up a benign explanation that doesn't actually match your kitten's specific situation. A quick call to your vet or an emergency line gives you a real assessment based on what you're actually observing, not a generic list of possibilities. Mistake number 3, giving any human medication to your kitten without explicit veterinary guidance, even something that seems harmless like a small dose of children's medication. Cat physiology processes many common human medications completely differently than ours does, And substances that are safe for humans, including some very common over-the-counter pain relievers, can be genuinely toxic to cats, even in small amounts. Mistake number 4, restraining a distressed or injured kitten too forcefully in an attempt to help them, which can escalate their fear and sometimes worsen an existing injury. Use a towel to gently wrap and stabilize an injured kitten for transport, providing both physical support and a sense of enclosure that can actually be calming rather than gripping tightly with bare hands, which tends to trigger more struggling. Mistake number 5, forgetting that a stressed or injured cat, even one who's normally gentle and affectionate, may bite or scratch out of pain and fear during a medical crisis, and going in without appropriate precaution. Approach calmly, speak softly, and if you have access to a towel, using it to gently wrap and restrain your kitten during handling protects both of you and generally results in a calmer, more controlled transport to the vet. Mistake number 6, panicking visibly in front of your kitten, which is completely understandable but genuinely counterproductive. Cats are remarkably attuned to human emotional states, something we touched on earlier, and a kitten who's already frightened or in pain can become considerably more distressed by picking up on frantic energy from you. This doesn't mean suppressing your own genuine fear entirely. That's not realistic in a real emergency. But taking even a few seconds to consciously slow your breathing and lower your voice before handling your kitten can make the entire experience, for both of you, noticeably calmer and more manageable. Mistake number 7, delaying the trip to the vet in order to keep on monitoring symptoms at home for reassurance, essentially using observation as a substitute for actually seeking care. It's natural to want more certainty before committing to an emergency vet visit, especially given the cost and inconvenience involved, but with the true emergencies we've covered today, the appropriate amount of monitoring is often measured in minutes, not hours. If you find yourself an hour into watching a kitten who's struggling to breathe, hoping it resolves on its own, that's a sign to stop watching and start driving. Let's talk briefly about safe transport, since how you move an injured or acutely ill kitten to the vet genuinely matters, sometimes more than owners realize in the moment. For a kitten who can move on their own but is injured or distressed, gently place them in their carrier, ideally lined with a towel for comfort and to help absorb any accidents along the way. For a kitten who's unable to move, unconscious, or has a suspected spinal or significant limb injury, use a flat, rigid surface if one's available, a cutting board, a thin book, or even a sturdy piece of cardboard to slide underneath them as a makeshift stretcher, minimizing additional movement of the injury during transport. Keep the car ride as calm and direct as possible, and if you can, call ahead to the vet or emergency clinic while you're en route so they know you're coming and can prepare accordingly, which genuinely saves valuable time once you arrive, sometimes allowing them to have a team ready and waiting the moment you walk through the door, rather than starting the intake process from scratch. Before we wrap up, let's run through a few of the questions that come up most often around this topic. How do I know if something is a genuine emergency versus something that can wait for a regular appointment? As a general rule, anything involving breathing difficulty, inability to urinate, suspected poisoning, seizures, uncontrolled bleeding, or a kitten who's unresponsive or unable to stand warrants immediate emergency care. Things like mild, brief digestive upset, small superficial scrapes, or a single instance of sneezing generally warrant monitoring and a call to your regular vet during business hours rather than an emergency visit, though when genuinely uncertain, a phone call to ask is always the right move, and no vet or emergency line will fault you for calling to check. What if I can't afford emergency vet care in the moment it's needed? This is a real concern for a lot of owners, and it's worth researching in advance, before you're in a crisis, rather than during one. Many areas have charitable veterinary funds, payment plan options through emergency clinics, or organizations specifically set up to help with unexpected veterinary costs. Knowing these resources exist ahead of time And having a rough sense of which ones are available in your specific area means you're not trying to research financial options in the middle of an already overwhelming situation. Should I keep any medications on hand specifically for kitten emergencies? Generally, no, beyond what your vet specifically prescribes or recommends for your individual kitten. Cat physiology is different enough from ours, and different enough between individual cats depending on weight, age, and health status, that keeping general-purpose medications on hand for self-administration is more likely to cause harm than help. The exception is anything your vet has specifically prescribed and given you clear instructions for using in a defined situation. Is pet insurance worth considering specifically because of situations like these? This is a genuinely personal financial decision that depends on your circumstances, your kitten's breed and risk factors, and the specific coverage terms available where you live. So it's worth researching the actual policies available to you rather than a blanket recommendation. What's worth knowing is that emergency veterinary care, particularly anything involving surgery, hospitalization, or specialist treatment, can be a significant unexpected expense, and having thought through how you'd handle that cost, whether through insurance, a dedicated savings fund, or another approach, before you're facing an actual bill, tends to make an already stressful situation somewhat more manageable. Should I take a pet first aid or CPR class specifically? If one's available in your area, absolutely, and it's worth doing before you ever need it rather than after. Hands-on practice, even just once, tends to build a kind of muscle memory and confidence that reading or watching alone genuinely can't replicate. And in a moment of real crisis, that practiced familiarity can make the difference between freezing up and being able to act quickly and calmly. What should I do if I'm genuinely not sure whether something is an emergency and I can't reach my vet? Call the nearest emergency animal hospital regardless, even just to describe the situation over the phone. Most emergency clinics are staffed specifically to help triage these calls, and they'd much rather talk you through a situation that turns out to be minor than have an owner sit at home uncertain during something that turns out to be serious. There's no such thing as a silly question when it comes to your kitten's safety, and every vet and emergency line has heard every version of, "Is this actually serious?" more times than you'd expect. One last thing before we close this one out. I know this section covered a lot of heavier material than usual, and I genuinely hope none of you ever need most of it. But if you found this useful, or if you've been through something like this already with your own kitten, let us know in the comments. It helps other new owners feel more prepared, and honestly, it helps normalize the fact that these things happen even to careful, attentive owners who did everything right, and that being prepared, not perfect, is really the whole goal. Let's bring this together into the core takeaways for this section, since we've covered a genuinely large amount of ground. Have your regular vet's number and your nearest emergency clinic's information saved and easy to find before you ever need them. Build a basic first aid kit and know your kitten's normal vital signs so you have a real baseline for comparison. Recognize the true emergencies that require immediate action without waiting. Difficulty breathing, choking, suspected poisoning, urinary blockage, seizures, severe bleeding, and significant trauma. Avoid the common mistakes that make emergencies worse: waiting too long, self-diagnosing online, giving human medication without guidance, and over-restraining an injured kitten. And know how to safely transport an injured or acutely ill kitten to get them care as quickly and safely as possible, using a towel for gentle restraint and a rigid surface if a spinal or significant limb injury is suspected. Stay as calm as you can manage in the moment, since your kitten reads your emotional state and responds to it. And don't let the desire for more certainty talk you into delaying a trip that genuinely can't wait. None of this replaces an actual veterinarian, and none of it means you need to become an expert overnight. It simply means you're prepared rather than caught completely off guard if and when something happens. And if you want a resource that goes even deeper into exactly this kind of preparation, specifically built around the health situations that come up most often in vulnerable cats, our Emergency First Aid for Senior and Disabled Indoor Cats Guide covers a lot of related ground and is linked below for anyone who wants that information in a format they can keep close at hand permanently, not just for this one video, something you can pull up in seconds rather than searching for in a panic. One final reflection before we close out this whole guide. It's completely natural to feel a little unsettled after a section like this one. Running through worst-case scenarios isn't exactly the fun, feel-good content most of us come to a channel like this for. But there's a real difference between anxiety and preparedness, even though they can feel similar in the moment you're absorbing information like this. Anxiety keeps you circling the same worry without a plan. Preparedness means that if one of these situations does arise, some future version of you already knows the first 3 things to do, already has the numbers saved, already recognizes the warning signs without having to piece it together under pressure. That's genuinely the entire goal of covering this material, not to make you worry more about your kitten, but to make sure that if a hard moment does come, you're equipped to move through it calmly and effectively, giving your kitten the best possible chance at a good outcome. Most kittens, thankfully, grow into healthy adult cats without ever needing most of what we've covered today put into practice. But for the ones who do encounter one of these situations, the preparation genuinely makes all the difference in how it unfolds. Let's step back for a moment and look at everything we've actually covered today, because it's genuinely a lot, and it's worth seeing how it all connects. We started with the socialization window, that narrow, critical stretch of time that shapes whether your cat grows up confident or anxious for the rest of their life. We moved into the first 48 hours in their new home, the safe room method, the car ride, and all the small decisions that determine how quickly your kitten settles in. From there, we covered bite inhibition, teaching your kitten to channel their genuine, healthy, predatory instincts into toys instead of your hands, so you end up with a gentle adult cat rather than one with a reputation for ambushing anyone who walks by. And we closed with health emergencies, not to make you anxious, but to make sure that if something ever does go wrong, you're equipped to respond quickly and calmly, rather than caught completely off guard. Notice how much these 4 pieces actually depend on each other. A kitten who's well socialized handles their first 48 hours in a new home with noticeably less fear. A kitten who feels secure and settled during those first days is easier to redirect during play, since a calm, confident kitten makes better decisions about bite pressure than an overstimulated, anxious one. And a kitten who's been handled gently and consistently from the start is considerably easier to examine and transport if a genuine emergency ever does arise, since they're not fighting you out of a lifetime of fear around being held or restrained. None of this is a checklist to complete in isolation. It's one continuous relationship you're building, piece by piece from the very first day. If you found this guide useful, let us know in the comments which section hit home the most for where you are right now with your own kitten, and feel free to come back to any part of this whenever the next stage becomes relevant. Since a kitten who's passed the socialization window today will eventually be the same kitten going through their first vet visit or their first accidental tumble off the couch. And if you haven't already, subscribe, since we've got plenty more ahead, including exactly how to introduce your kitten to an existing resident cat, step by step, building on everything we've covered here today. Thanks for sticking with us through this one, cat lovers. We know it was a long one, and we'll see you in the next video.